Greetings, History of Sexuality students. This is Professor Bowen here with an instructional video on how to create annotations for your research project. By this point in your research, you've got a topic, you've formulated a research question, and you have also assembled a nice list of primary and secondary sources related to your research question. So the next task is to actually begin the writing. Specifically, you're going to compose annotations for some of your secondary and primary sources. And you may be asking yourself, how exactly do I do this? What is supposed to go into these annotations? This is perhaps something you have not done before, and I do have very specific things that I'm looking for in these annotations. So the purpose of this video is to explain those things and alleviate whatever concerns you might have about this fourth stage of the project. All right, so first, what exactly are those instructions? So the first thing that I should say here is that you are not required to produce annotations for all of your sources. At this point in your research, you've got a list of 10 sources. 7 of them are secondary sources, 3 of them are primary sources, but you only need to write annotations for 3 of them, specifically 2 secondary sources and 1 primary source. So you get to choose. And when choosing the sources that you want to annotate, my suggestion would be that you go with those that are most closely related to your topic and that directly speak to your research question. Because one of the big things that I want to learn from your annotations is how exactly these sources help you figure out an answer to your research question. Once you've got those 3 sources chosen, the next step is obviously to compose the annotations. And I'm going to talk specifically about what should go into these in a moment. For now, let me just say that each annotation should be around 2 full-sized paragraphs. There isn't a maximum or minimum word count for this assignment, but if you think you have 3 annotations, each of them is 2 paragraphs, this is going to be about a 6-paragraph paper-ish thing. In addition to the annotations, I would also appreciate it if you could give me an update on the state of your research. If your topic has undergone slight or more major modifications, tell me. If your research question has changed over the course of the last couple weeks, maybe it has because you found that some of your sources didn't work so well, or maybe you found that some of your sources didn't really address the question that you were initially interested in, and that might have prompted you to go down a slightly different path. If that's the case, and for most of us I think it will, because that is the way that research naturally evolves, just tell me. Tell me what has changed since you started undertaking this research. So you have those things, your annotations, your updated proposal, plus any changes to your bibliography. Put that all together in a single package document and upload it to Moodle by the end of the day on Sunday, October 25th, and you'll be in good shape. So, how do we actually produce these annotations and what should go into them? I'm going to talk about secondary and primary source annotations separately because these are very different things and the requirements for each of them are different. And we'll start with secondary source annotations. I thought it would be helpful to provide a sample to give you a kind of template that you might use as you're putting together your own annotations. Feel free to use this one as a kind of formulaic guide if you like. It's actually an annotation that I myself produced when I was in graduate school and I was taking a class on the ancient world, and I did a project that had to do with female healers in ancient Greece. And as part of my research, I found this really interesting paper by an historian called Rebecca Fleming The paper is called Women, Writing, and Medicine in the Classical World, and I annotated it. I annotated it much like the way you're going to annotate some of your secondary sources for this project. So, what to do? First thing I want to point out right off the bat, before anything else, make sure that you cite the source. Each annotation should begin with the reference to the source itself. Might seem like an obvious point, but it's one that people often forget. So do make sure to start with the actual citation. And then, from there on, as I said before, you're going to have 2 paragraphs for each annotation, roughly. My suggestion would be that you divide them this way. Make the first paragraph more descriptive, where you're summarizing what the historian is doing in the paper. And then in the second paragraph, you can get more analytical and cast judgment on their claims. So, first paragraph, more of a summary. I want you to start out by getting into their argument as quickly as possible. From the very first sentence of your annotation, I want to know, what is this person trying to prove? What is the major claim, in other words, that they are advancing in this book or essay or journal article, whatever it is? Get right to the heart of the matter. Let us know what it is that they're trying to convince us of. And you can take a couple of sentences to explain what their basic argument is in the paper. When you do that, I'd like you to get into the details in a number of ways. First, I want to know a little bit about how the author reached their conclusion. Or in other words, what is the foundation or the basis on which their argument stands? What kinds of sources were they looking at? And you can list these. As you can see in this annotation, I've said Fleming uses literary and archaeological sources. Okay, that's good. It's also a little bit vague, so you can get more specific with it. You can talk about, well, what kinds of literary evidence does she use? Books? Name those books. Archaeological artifacts? Tell me a little bit about those as well. That's kind of what I do for the rest of this paragraph, right? And I do that in a way that connects these sentences to the overall point that the author is trying to make. So in this first paragraph, when you're summarizing the argument, make sure you talk about the evidence that the author uses to try to illustrate or back up their argument. Then the second paragraph, as we said, this is going to be more analytical. This is where you put on your critical thinking hat and assess the validity of the author's argument, where you tell me very directly that you are persuaded or that you are not persuaded by what the author is trying to prove. So, for example, I start out the second paragraph of this annotation very directly, very matter-of-factly saying, the literary evidence leaves much to be desired. That is me rendering my verdict, or telling the reader, I don't think this part of the argument worked very well. I was not convinced. After you do that, explain. Why wasn't I convinced? What did I find lacking in the author's evidence? What did I find fault with? Explain the rationale behind your evaluation. And you can take some sentences doing that as well. And when you do, again, as I said before, it's helpful to get as specific as possible. And one of the ways that you can do this is by citing specific passages from the text. So if you read this paragraph here, you'll see that while I'm not convinced on the literary side of things, I do think that the archaeological evidence is more in favor of the argument Fleming is trying to make here. And I say that by quoting a specific passage from Fleming's article where she uses some archaeological evidence, an inscription in this case, to support her claim. You can do that too. Where appropriate, please do feel free to reference particular bits of the text that you're analyzing. Of course, when you do so, be sure to cite it properly using quotes and giving us a reference number for the page where you found that quote. Now, there's one thing that, shame on me, I forgot to do with this sample annotation, and I want to talk about that because it's something that I would like you to do. I would like you to do a little bit better than what I just showed you for your own annotation, and that is this. I would like you to talk about how this particular source that you're annotating actually speaks to you personally about your research question and about the thing that you want to answer in your project, right? So talk about the specific insights that you have gleaned from this source and how they relate to the things that you're trying to figure out in your research. Make it personal. All right, so that takes care of secondary source annotations, but what about primary sources? So some of these things are going to be very similar to your secondary source annotations. For one, you're always going to start with the citation itself, but on the whole, these are very different things, right? Your primary sources, obviously, they're not written by a historian. They're not scholarly in any sense, really. So you're not going to do things like describe the author's argument and critique it. There's not going to be that kind of descriptive or analytical content in the primary source annotation. So what actually am I looking for here? Okay, so we said start with the citation, and then I would like you to talk about, to the extent you can, the circumstances of production for the source. This, I realize, might not always be possible because sometimes we don't know the authors of primary sources. There's a lot of these that are just anonymous because they were written by an unknown person or because we lost track of who this person was. It, in those cases, just can't be stated with certainty. If that's the case for you, you can offer an educated guess by saying this source was likely written by a physician, or it appears to have been composed by a poet or something like that. You can give a kind of rough sense of who the author might have been. And often, especially when we're dealing with sources in the ancient or the pre-modern worlds, you might not know when the source was first created or published. You might not know where it appeared, if it was part of some larger collection, if it was a book, if it was a document produced for governmental authorities, or what have you. But again, to the extent that you can, talk about when it was published, where it was published, and what it was created for, the kind of the purpose of the document. In addition to these things, in your primary source annotation, I want you to kind of briefly summarize the entire source. And there are a few key things here that all historians do whenever they're annotating primary sources, and we do this in our own research. Talk about a couple of different things. One is the audience. Who do you think that this source was produced for? Who is the intended reader of whatever text it is that you have come across? Again, you can't do this with certainty, but you probably can get a general sense from your reading of it. And in addition to talking about the possible audience for the source, you can certainly talk about the author's aims. Audience and aims are really important for understanding primary sources. What was it that they were trying to accomplish in this source? What do you have as a sense of their goals, their reasons for writing it? Were they trying to persuade someone of something? Were they trying to inform a particular person or a group of people about an event or a set of circumstances? Again, these things aren't always readily available upon reading primary source text, but to the best of your ability, talk about their audiences and their aims. Again, I also want you to get personal here. So talk about how the source speaks to your own research questions, about the insights that it contains for you and your own project, and just like with the secondary sources, get into the details. Talk about specific passages, cite specific words, and try to put it in dialogue with your secondary sources. All right, that's all I've got for now. Hope this video was helpful. See you later.